Our next presenter is Scott Decker. Scott has been with ASU now for 11, 12 years. That's what I thought. Scott, I think, has one of the more powerful careers in our field. He's widely recognized as one of the top 5 gang scholars in the world. He helped create a organization, or I should say found an organization called Eurogang, in which adopted a broad set of principles for the study of gangs internationally. And that group and the work that Scott did has had a very profound effect on a number of gang scholars around the world, and has been moving that field forward. But he also has a lot of other interests in terms of prevention, intervention, and suppression work, and working alongside the police and other NGOs. He's a very valued member of Department of Justice's community, gone to the White House on several occasions to consult on a variety of matters, testified in front of various Senate and House subcommittees on matters. And he's going to be talking a little bit today on some intervention work. Currently, he's working in Honduras on a project, but he's done a lot of work, not just on Propante Mas in Honduras with respect to intervention work, but he spent a lot of time on intervention work. And some of that originates from his work with active offenders. He's one of a small handful of academics who, for lack of a better word, collaborate with offenders in one way or another, finding ways to meet with them, interact with them, and you can find his work that is very accessible in terms of his work in ethnographic strategies of studying burglars, robbers, gang members. More recently, he's been actively involved with Google Corporation in dealing with some of the online communities and how do we retrieve information from gang members online. And so he's very actively involved with understanding the streets and how the streets operate. So I thought that it was best fitting that he speak a little bit more about some of his work.
Thanks, Chuck. In 2002, I was a keynote speaker before 1,600 police officers. I had an hour and a half on the program at the Police Executive Research Forum. They meet in San Diego, so a lot of guys and women from Buffalo and Ypsilanti and pretty cold places are out in San Diego in December. And I looked at the program when I got registered, and I was the speaker right before open bar. And so I have experience trying to bring these talks in, although I don't think this one will come in the 2 minutes before lunch is served. I did want to back up and comment about the issue that Ed ran into where there are dead bodies on the ground, and that becomes routinized in a way for children. Many of you may know and may be observing, this is National Holocaust Week in the US and across Europe. It's a time when we reflect on the experiences not only of the Holocaust in Germany, but of other Holocausts that have taken place around the world. And one of the books that I try and read at least every other year is Hannah Arendt's remarkable book, Banality of Evil, in which she takes head on the question, how can it be that these atrocities occurred and people didn't speak up? And as Chuck Ramsey often says, why didn't the police do something to stop this? And she describes a process by which violence, and this would be my take on it, the banality of violence, becomes so routinized and so normal a part of life that the reactions that we would take against it and say, you know, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. We're not going to allow this to happen. Young children can't be exposed to this. A child that sees a dead body needs some help, some intervention, some counseling. But that banality of evil, I think, also plays in to the routinization of a banality of violence. So my friend Guillermo and I have some experience. Most of my scars are healed. I hope yours are from dealing with the community. I know during the rollout for gang programs in Los Angeles, GRID, that we think gang members have turf. The community really has turf, and the community knows how to hold on to their turf and repel outsiders who try and take over their turf. And sometimes they visit their unhappiness and displeasure on public officials who get to deliver the news about what's going to happen in a particular community and what's going to go on. I want to talk about the community largely as a context for where we've talked about programs, but also strategies, initiatives take place. We don't know much about the communities and how communities accept programming and how communities change programming. The gangs have turf, the cops and the agencies all have turf, but the turf is in the community. The community knows that turf and protects it and acts in ways that often make program implementation much more difficult and much more complicated for those of us that would like to see high fidelity scores before we move on with some sort of quantitative assessment. I do want to point out that in typical American fashion, I know much of the research that's been done by Americans. My Spanish is limited to what Google Translate will give me, so you have a sense of sometimes there's a word that appears that doesn't make sense in my translations. And I was asked to keynote a conference in Lyon, France last May, and I have a rule that when I'm asked to go to France, I dutifully say, yes, I will go. And started to pull together all the research I could find. And the conference, why would an American travel to France for a conference about Latin American and Caribbean gangs, other than there's a Dutch academic named Dennis Rogers, who has produced about a dozen PhD students who are all fluent, as many Europeans are, in multiple languages, and have done their dissertations based on 2, 3, 4, 5 years of field work in Latin America that is largely published in Spanish, and that means Americans are completely ignorant of not what it says only, but also its mere existence. And included in the group of Rogers' students were 2 women who got themselves assigned, got in to 2 Central American prisons, one of which the guards had largely abandoned to the inmates to run on their own. So there's a lot more about the community than we know. There's a lot more research that ends up in our RCTs, and at some level, I think it's worth paying attention to what those are. One quickly learns that gangs aren't the only issue that guns, political conflicts, and especially the extreme poverty that characterizes many neighborhoods are worth paying attention to. I think in my reading and limited experience, that integrating key community agencies and key community groups is important. In the States, we say that right at the start of every program, and then struggle here even to figure out how to go about doing that. But in the Central American, Latin American context, I think it's also important to talk about the role of religion as well, and the role of religiosity in the community. I distinguish between the formal practices of religion and the beliefs that people hold. They're often 2 different things. We need to account for them. One of the large and ongoing debates, and Thomas alluded to it, is the role of outreach workers, which going back to the 1970s and the Ladino Hills Project that was done in Los Angeles, the argument was paying attention to the gang with outreach workers strengthens solidarity in the gang and makes it harder to break up. Well, maybe, but one pretty descriptive one-shot case study from 40 plus years ago hardly seems worth hanging our hat on. I think the outreach workers give us a link to the community. They represent programs to community. The role of community groups in leadership in programs is an important issue to debate. And one of the things that outsiders fail to recognize quite often are historic disputes and alliances within community. I had the experience of being at Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention when it announced $14 million of funding for 5 communities to go after gangs. And while the deputy administrator, who was used to people listening to him and not interrupting him, was talking, a young they're all young to me, but a middle-aged African-American man walked up and grabbed the microphone for questions and said, "I'm the angry black man and I'm here for my money." And the deputy administrator kind of stepped back from his microphone and figured there must be some problem here. I'll keep going with my talk. And he grabbed the microphone again and repeated himself, and he said, the administrator said, "Well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? I've been working in that community for 20 years, and you're not going to waltz in here overnight and pass money out to my community and my relationships where I've been working while you've been hiding in your office in Washington, D.C. And unless and until you pay attention to the community, you're not going to have access to one gang kid, because they all listen to me and they won't listen to you, Mr. Washington Insider." And that prompted quite a response from the deputy chief from the Milwaukee Police Department, who had accompanied the group, and said, "Hey, we want the money. Don't screw this up. We want the money for the program. The mayor's on board." If we fail to understand communities, community leaders, community structures, community histories, not only are we not going to get in the door, but if we get in the door, our chances of being successful are greatly compromised. There are a number of U.S. models. You've seen them. It may look like we coordinated some of these things in advance, but indeed, serendipity rears its beautiful head. The OJJDP model, heavy community involvement, as Thomas noted, especially in the case of Spergel, very difficult to implement. The Safe Futures model spent $80 million in programming across 6 sites and was implemented successfully in only 1 of the 6. 2 of the 6 gave all the money back, and 1 of them was in litigation suing the city for a number of years. So this implementation is important and requires the community. LA Grid, which is a risk-based approach, requires community engagement, but not at the level of the comp strategy. Boston Ceasefire, community's a key part, largely through outreach workers, through local ministers, and through volunteer citizens. Cure Violence, Chicago's Cure Violence program with a strong public health emphasis also has a community role, but a somewhat more limited role. And the one place where the community's not seen at all and where we cannot report positive results for reducing violence and tamping down gang membership are suppression-only approaches. This is what I call the response pyramid. I've told my children this may be my only contribution to the world, so maybe if it goes on my gravestone when the time comes, that would be a useful thing. What the response pyramid says is, and I think it applies to gang members and I think it applies to general offenders, is that as we go up the pyramid, these are the more serious offenders. So the ones at the top, serious and chronic, guns, shooting, violence, early onset, late persistence, high levels of offending and victimization. We got to do something about them, but they're not our only problem. Down at the bottom, the largest group, the largest share of the population, is the general population of youth and families who live in at-risk areas, most of which don't join gangs, don't have guns, don't shoot people, and aren't victimized. So our challenge is, what do we do? Oh, and complicating, these are also typically very poor, highly disadvantaged neighborhoods without the kinds of jobs and job training and social capital that would allow people to move up and out or up and better. As we move up from the at-risk, then we've got higher risk for involvement in violence. These often include brothers and sisters. If somebody asks me, what are the markers I should look for? I always say, if they've got an older brother who's a real active gang member, pay attention to the younger brothers. Give them services. Give them attention. Divert them. Keep them busy after school. The serious and chronic offenders, we have really, and in the U.S. we excel at this solution, and that's prison and jail. That's conviction and prison time. But we're all learning with attempts to deal with mass incarceration that it can't be for everybody. There are some promising programs, day reporting centers, for example, that target young men, mostly, though sometimes young women at high risk for involvement in crime, at the times of the day they're most likely to offend. So we don't do the same thing for everybody. Now that doesn't sound like a complicated idea, and it doesn't sound like a convoluted college professor idea, but in practice it proves to be much more complicated than it sounds. This is, all the criminologists in the room are ready to put their hand over their heart as they recognize the age crime curve. One of the things we know and we know best, we know that in general for delinquency onset and gang membership, somewhere around 13 or 14. The really good news is, in 2 or 3 years, most gang members and most delinquents have aged out. So our growing older is our best crime control strategy at this point in time. A little later, our 2 best crime control strategies are marriage and jobs. Marriage and jobs, marriage and jobs. The Saudis' anti-terrorism program has learned this lesson. And their anti-terrorism program marries people off. Now, if you live in a country where you can coerce marriage, it makes that a little easier, though there's some other, as a father of 3 daughters, there are some other negative consequences to that. But if you have a reserve of oil money, you can also employ people. You can also get them working and getting jobs. So what do we do here? The community recognizes this uptick almost before anyone else does. They see it before the police. So in terms of surveillance, the community, and I don't mean surveillance in the, we got a wiretap and binoculars on you. I mean surveillance in the public health sense. The community is our best ally and our best asset for interventions here at the early onset of delinquency or gang membership. It's also the case that the community is our best ally in recognizing declines. Our worst partner in that is law enforcement. Because when you're in a law enforcement database, when you've got multiple FI cards that have been developed, field information cards that have been developed on you, you're in that system and you stay in the system. So the cops are among the last to recognize someone has moved out of the peak delinquency or peak gang membership phase, and the community would be at the forefront of the group that would recognize that. So there's a real critical role for the community to play. Lots of challenges in working with the community. What community? Is the community the people who show up when there's money? Or is the community that you want to be working with the folks and agencies who show up when there's no money? When there's money for crime prevention and money for intervention, the table's full. Everybody's there because they want their piece of the pie. When the money's all gone and you don't have resources, the people at the table are probably the ones you want to be working with. We've had this discussion earlier about whether risk factors and other conditions are constant across cultures and countries. Americans would be well reminded that there are multiple cultures within many of the countries we're talking about. We don't know enough about extreme poverty, lack of economic development, and whether that hinders community engagement. The database issue has been discussed before, but the quality of some information hinders us and holds us back. We know that in some cases, economic crime is an important element of supporting a family, and that there are also, whether because of war or challenges from illegal organizations, perhaps narcotics, many social institutions are weak and either incapable or less successful in combating criminal organizations than we would hope and that we would need. However, lots of advantages to working with the community. They recognize early, they have resources, often that are not economic capital, but are social capital and personal capital. And then finally, a series of big questions. Will American models work outside of America? How to make interventions local and tailor them to local needs or conditions, and the community can play a role in that. Can funding be found and sustained? And if not, is there the will to do it on our own? Will European support be forthcoming? Given the number of European researchers who have received support to work in Central America, Latin America, South America, one wonders if programmatic support will be forthcoming. And finally, can community residents be encouraged to participate at sufficient levels to produce change? So it's not open bar time, but it would be.
Questions for Scott?
As far as you were mentioning jobs, have you looked at workforce development for youth as one of the ways to combat this as well?
Certainly in the States that's been done. One of the things that was learned the hard way time and time and time again in the States is sending unprepared youth who've never worked before to a job is a bad experience. Employers won't take them back again. They experience more failure. So the right amount of job prep, we think there ought to be a workforce development component as part of a pre-release plan for every one of the 2 million young men and women who are behind bars now. So getting them ready to work, and that means, you can't work without a social security card. No one should leave prison without a driver's license or a social security card. Those are two things you need to function in American society if you're going to work. But workforce development has to come long before the jobs. Our experience has been employers are happy to give a chance to people who've been in trouble. But it's our job to make them prepared for success as opposed to destined to fail.
And what about before trouble, when you're looking at the at-risk population?
Certainly in those populations and in the neighborhoods they live in, concentrated disadvantage is so high that the chances of them knowing someone who holds a steady job are pretty low. And many of us get our job, especially our first jobs, through the next door neighbor knew somebody who knew somebody. And those networks are few and far between, especially in many of the neighborhoods characterized by high levels of economic disadvantage.
Robin?
Yeah, thank you. I feel like I could probably take a class from you and learn a lot, so thank you. It was great. You're a great speaker. I just wanted to ask the questions about, coming from an international, sorry, I'm going to talk really loud.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Where is the element in this of the institutionalization of the state's role? I think we keep looking for American money. We keep looking for sustainability, and we keep talking about the community. What the community wants, besides to feel safe, when we're building a culture of trying to shift the culture of violence, is they want some reciprocity. And if we're looking at the bigger picture of decentralization, where is the social auditing and our role in creating that level of budgeting, if you will, to ensure that these models will exist with or without American or European funding, because I think that's what we should be doing. And so the other question I have is that we're looking at these models that have existed here, but my question to all of you researchers is that, are there models that exist in other countries that have been studied that are equally as relevant? Or have been studied?
I don't know the answer to your latter question.
Yeah, that's my question, that have been studied, so thank you. How
Yep.
many times answer that? Yeah, models, he said yes, but have been studied, no.
To the first question, is the goal to spin off, to receive the funding, start something, and then spin it off and let it be owned locally? Or is it to go in without program funding and do things to increase basic capacity? Those are two different models. And the spin-off model that says you're going to get grant money, you're going to get something started, and then what we rarely talk about is sustainability. And to me, sustainability really happens if the community is engaged and involved. Because once the offices are closed and once the people have gone back home, or it's the community people who will be playing a major role in sustaining a program, sustaining an effort, if only by putting pressure on the local government to pick up with what was left off. Another model of that is blended funding that says, here's 5 years of funding, and each year the external funding is reduced and the internal funding has to pick it up, and there needs to be a real commitment for that. That's another model to ensure that, I've been involved in dozens and dozens of gang and violence prevention programs in the U.S. and I always have mixed feelings because when the money's gone, nobody comes to the meetings anymore and the effort seems to go away. St. Louis was, thanks Alex, put up on the map for its high homicide rate. There was a program that ran for 2 years, and those are the only 2 years in the last 50 that there were fewer than 100 homicides. And they're back up they're going to be flirting with 200 again, nearly double what they were. Nobody has said, let's go back and do what we did when our number of homicides were half of what they are now. And those models are out there, and there are people who were around when they were implemented. But we have real short memories when we achieve success. And I think it's incumbent not just on the externals, but especially on the locals and the community people to say, hey, wait a gosh darn minute here. What happens when these people pull out?
Question? Sure.
I'm wondering, and not just for you, but for some of the other speakers, how do you get high buy-in from the police and the politicians in the Latin America and the Caribbean? I'm speaking specifically about the Caribbean. When the focus is on getting results now, and sometimes even when you have results generally, let's say your crime is dropping immeasurably, but your homicide is up. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. I spent some time with the OAS doing a little study in some of this, and I'm back in the police service. And the thing is, they want results now. So how do you get buy-in for research-based approaches?
One of my favorite books about the police is called Bending Granite, and it tells the story about trying to change police culture, which is very difficult. But what about the police and changing?
Okay. One of the very interesting dynamics, especially in the Caribbean, and present company accepted over here with Dr. Harriet. I'm going to talk about this a little bit tomorrow in my closing remarks, so I won't say much. But just that criminology as a discipline in the Caribbean, and particularly in Trinidad and Tobago until recently, has established an identity. I like to think of it as sort of throwing rocks at the at the agency heads and at politicians and so forth, right? And so you have examples in Latin America. We have Anthony, who works very closely with police throughout the Caribbean. We have Claudio Beato back here, who has worked very closely with the police in Brazil and elsewhere, in Uruguay. And so there are models, but Trinidad is a really interesting example until just in the last few years of an entire criminological infrastructure that has established an identity of being on the attack. So in this country, we would call it more like radical or critical criminology, as opposed to a brand of criminology that envisions itself as working with agencies, attempting to help agencies, providing technical assistance to agencies, these kinds of things. And so it's really, really difficult to establish those kinds of researcher-practitioner partnerships when the criminology side of the business has basically developed its identity around antagonism, right? This is starting to change in Trinidad. You've got your commissioner of police is working on a PhD. You've got lots of high-level officials working on PhDs, and you now have a criminological infrastructure that is starting to change directions and is starting to sort of open itself up to research much more. That's a very promising future, I think.
Question? Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Try.
No me quedó claro un concepto.
He's not clear about one concept.
Si
If-
bien es cierto, las instituciones policiales representan al
If
Estado.
it's true that
y
the
están
pol-
dotadas de esa autoridad. Pero-
so there's one concept that he's not clear about is about the police institutions.
Y de una u otra manera, poco a poco,
If
vamos
there
acercándonos
one
a
way,
la comunidad como un
one way or
socio,
another, we're getting close to the community
primario. Pero
in
no me
a
queda
primary
claro,
way. But I'm not clear
cuando usted dice que
when
el
you
peor
say
socio es la institución
that the
policial,
worst
Eso
partner is
debe-
the police.
se debe al
And that's
modelo que
because
utiliza la
of the model
institución
that
policial
the
o
police
a la
is
falta de
using,
confianza de
or
la
is
comunidad.
the community relying on the police?
Yep. One of the, thank you for your question. One of the real challenges is keeping the partners in any intervention working together. And so getting them to work on the same page can be quite a challenge. And this is relatively new, and I'm really proud to work with 4, 5, 8 of the best practitioners of this research partnership in the country, because this is really hard work. You've got to do all the regular research things, and then you've got to be able to balance relationships, which college professors often are not the best at, with people who work in agencies. So I think the challenge is for police and community groups to see a common ground. And one of the things a research partner as an external person can do is attempt to step back and look for the areas where there might be agreement. Let's agree we're going to disagree about some things, but let's look for the areas where we can work together. Let's look for the areas we're all concerned about. We don't want young children to be standing next to dead bodies at a crime scene. So how can we deal with that? We want to reduce victimization. So how can we, the community, help the police to do that? So I think the challenge is to find common ground to work together, recognizing each group, police, community, NGOs, the state, have their own territory, some of which is driven by legal responsibilities that they have to fulfill.
Anything else? Thank you.